This is the first of three lectures on Heidegger. The first lecture is Heidegger, Dasein, and the Question. The second will be entitled Heidegger and Truth, and the third will be on Heidegger, Spirit, and Fascism. In this first lecture, we're mostly concerned with clarifying how the Heideggerian concept of Dasein, which is sort of the being that is there in the world, is not the same or different from the Kantian, Hegelian, Marxian notion of the self as a kind of a rationally constructed subject. So we find here Heidegger deliberately breaking from that kind of epistemological model, which he sees as too Cartesian and let's say too rational in a very negative sense, and and then turning towards a concept of the subject, well, not of the subject, but of the self, of what it means to be a being in the world that is not, that doesn't follow this tradition that develops in the Western German idealist tradition, particularly after Kant, as influenced by Kant. So this is a sort of post-dialectical way of thinking about the self. Now, unlike Chomsky, Descartes does not break from the Kantian subject object dialectic, Hegelian subject object dialectic, because he simply doesn't understand it. He understands it very well. But he has very profound reservations about it. So we're going to look at this, and then we're going to also see how what Heidegger is calling Dasein is central to or is linked to the question of the question itself, or the process of questioning, or what, say, someone like Gadamer is going to later call the hermeneutic circle. These are really key hermeneutic concepts, key concepts to understanding Heidegger. And so we're going to kind of take it slow, and then we'll look at some key passages from some of his texts. Okay, so again, the name of the lecture is Heidegger, Dasein, and the Question, or we could even say Heidegger, Dasein, and the Question of the Question. What is going on here with this discourse about the question in Introduction to Metaphysics, but also in Being in Time? Okay, so the main text that we're gonna work with here are Being in Time, which was published in 1927. Many regard that as his sort of most significant work, or at least most influential work. The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, which was published 2 years later, and which deal with issues very much related to being in time, so much so that I don't think, in my view, you can't really fully understand what is being said in Being in Time unless you also read the Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, which follows fast upon it. Now, the Introduction to Metaphysics, as I've said, is probably the best introduction to Heidegger's thought. If you're coming to Heidegger for the first time, I always recommend reading that one before reading Being in Time. And then we'll have a look at Parmenides, because we'll see here Heidegger articulate in a very clear way what these different historical conceptions of truth are, and how when Greek is translated into Latin by the Romans, and the Greek philosophers become translated, that he's going to argue that there's a fundamental shift in the perception of truth and the concept of truth, which is going to be determinative in the history of Western philosophy. And then the Principle of Reason, published in 1955, which is a very short, but short in the way that Descartes' Discourse on Method is short, as in very carefully, tersely articulated meditation on Leibniz's Principle of Reason. And along with the Principle of Non-Contradiction in Aristotle, the Principle of Reason is going to be sort of the other principle that is important to know for doing work in metaphysics, particularly if you're interested in Heidegger. He does a very, very careful and thoughtful reading of Leibniz's Principle of Reason, which we'll also be drawing from. Okay, so just to, as we get started here, I want to identify some key Heideggerian concepts and terminology. So we've already, in a previous lecture, we already talked about the basic concepts of metaphysics as articulated in Timaeus and Phaedrus. And if you haven't watched those lectures yet, and you're not really sure what metaphysics are, I would urge you to watch those lectures first, because much of what we'll do here will draw upon the work that we've already done in thinking about what metaphysics are. And as I've said, you can't really read Heidegger. It's really difficult to read Heidegger unless you have some grounding in these basic concepts of metaphysics. And Timaeus is really one of the best places to go for this, because here we find Plato very concisely articulating the three basic concepts of metaphysics, of being, becoming, and non-being. All right, we're going to make sure that by the end of this lecture that we understand the difference between Dasein, what Dasein is, and how it differs from the subject in the Kantian, Hegelian, Marxian subject-object dialectic. We will address the question of what Heidegger is going to call a modality of being and an attunement or attunements. And we're going to see that the two fundamental modalities of being for Heidegger, which in an easier way to say modality of being is mood. It's a kind of a mood, as we discussed previously with Socrates' demon, the demonic as in a mood that comes upon you. And the two fundamental modalities of being we're going to see are care, sometimes in its more extreme articulated as anxiety, and then boredom. Care and boredom, as we're going to see, are the two fundamental modalities of being for Heidegger, as we'll discuss. And then, phenomenological hermeneutics. It's important to understand that Heidegger's thought didn't just spring up out of nowhere. He's thinking within a very particular German tradition, one that is, ironically, that Chomsky, for instance, is influenced by Humboldt. Humboldt is some view as the figure who inaugurated the German phenomenological hermeneutic tradition, but it includes many, many interesting thinkers. Edmund Husserl, for instance, to whom Heidegger dedicated Being and Time, and Dilthey, many Schleiermacher, many others that precede Heidegger, and then of course Gadamer after Heidegger is still working within this tradition. The question of the question is something that we'll discuss, and then we're going to need to talk about what Gadamer is going to call, pre-understanding or prejudice. He's going to try to recuperate a non-stigmatized concept of prejudice, which is going to link to the Heideggerian discussion of the is or of being, as we'll see. And then the hermeneutic circle itself is something that these are all terms that by the end of this study you should understand these notions or have some orientation in them and be able to think and talk about them in order to read Heidegger. Okay, well, all right, let's begin with the question that is first in rank, and this is the question that inaugurates the text, Introduction to Metaphysics. Heidegger starts out, and we've already looked at this before, but we'll read it again. Why are there beings instead of nothing at all? That is the question. Presumably, it is no arbitrary question. Why are there beings instead of nothing at all? That is the question that is first in rank. And we said that this is a kind of also thinking about what Aristotle calls the principle of non-contradiction, although note in Aristotle it's articulated as a principle, and Heidegger as a question rather than a thesis. But in Aristotle's articulation of this from his metaphysics, no one can believe that the same thing can at the same time both be and not be. All right, so this is the principle that really inaugurates metaphysics, and so it's whatever your views on metaphysics are, it's something that you should know if you want to do critical theory, read contemporary continental philosophy. And so, again, in the introduction to metaphysics, this question that Heidegger says is first in rank, arguably one could say the entire introduction to metaphysics is nothing but a gloss on that one question, which we're calling again here Hamlet's question. And, when we look at Derrida's Spectres of Marx, which we'll do in a lecture that is going to follow this, we'll see again, this is really important to understanding of Spectres of Marx as well. This question of being, not being, which Hamlet asks very famously in the most famous soliloquy perhaps in all of Shakespeare's work, when Hamlet stands upon the edge of the cliff and says, to be or not to be, that is the question. That's the question we're asking here, the question that is Hamlet's question that Heidegger is wrestling with. And we note from the beginning that it is a question. And it's Heidegger is more interested in asking questions than in asserting theses. And so in a sense, we're going to see he's not going to do anything except ask this question. He's going to ask it over and over again in different ways. He's going to try to stay as much as possible true to the the logic, if you could put it somewhat oxymoronic terms, problematic terms. In fact, is the question. It's the question, the inductive question that drives this philosophical discourse. Okay, now we've already said, I want to read this again. I want to read this again to you. We've already reviewed this when we looked at Plato. This was Heidegger's articulation of this. This is one I find to be one of the most key passages in the introduction to metaphysics, and one that I urge you to read and read again. And you can think about it, meditate upon it, because there's a lot that he's saying here. It's a very, very revealing passage in terms of thinking about how Heidegger himself thinks about metaphysics. And he says again, the threefold path provides this indication, unitary in itself. The way to being is unavoidable. The way to nothing or chora is inaccessible. The way to seeming is always accessible and traveled, but it can be avoided. All right. So there we have it, being, non-being, and becoming, and articulated here. And he's thinking, no doubt, of Gorgias, not Gorgias, but Parmenides in the very famous poem that Parmenides writes and that Heidegger meditates upon in his book Parmenides, when the thinker Parmenides is traveling upon a path through the forest, and he comes to an opening, and he beholds the deity Aletheia, who is the goddess Truth. Now Heidegger, who had a little cabin in the Black Forest in Germany, where he did much of the writing of his philosophy, kind of like to think of philosophy as a kind of a path. It's a path that we tread. And so he's treading a path. And I'll remind you that he makes this really central distinction between philosophizing and studying the history of philosophy. And so Heidegger is not interested in just studying the history of philosophy. He's interested in philosophizing, which is an act that one performs, and it's very different from just knowing and understanding the history of philosophy. So that's an important distinction we'll come back to, but one that you should bear in mind, that there is a difference between philosophizing, as Heidegger is going to claim or assert, and just really studying philosophy in an academic, historical sense. Okay, so Heidegger is going to say, so the man who truly knows is not the one who blindly runs after a truth, but only the one who constantly knows all three ways, that of being, that of not being, and that of seeming. Superior knowing, and all knowing is superior, is granted only to the one who has experienced the sweeping storm on the way to being, to whom the terror of the second way to the abyss of nothing has not remained foreign. Okay, and again, this is also because nothingness, chora, is linked to death as well, to the question of our non-existence, which is one of the reasons why we're going to see Heidegger is going to suggest people don't like to think about the nothing or chora, and it's because it reminds them of the fact of their own temporality or their impending death or non-existence, and who has still taken on the third way, the way of seeming, as a constant urgency. Okay, so it's not just a matter of having one's eyes fixed on what he's calling being here. It's also a matter of taking seeming, or what appears to be, as something that's quite urgent and worthy of consideration. Today, this is very different, say, for instance, from the Cartesian view, which is that the world of seeming is something that Descartes is going to regard as a mere kind of phantom that we should, or like a dream image that's not reliable. And so this is why Leibniz says Descartes doubted too much. He both doubted too much and doubted too little. Okay, and to dare everything with being, not being, and seeming all at once, that is to raise Dasein, this being that is there, about itself into the decision about being, non-being, and seeming. Okay, so that's a really interesting and thoughtful observation that he makes, that if you sit and meditate on for a while, or walk around, take a walk and meditate upon, it will it will prove to be very, very, it will yield a lot of material to think about for you, I'm sure. And note again that this is that he's also emphasizing here, underscoring the question of the decision about being. And we'll come back to this question of the decision, especially when we look at Derrida, who's going to inspectors of Marx, say that all decisions are made in madness, because we don't know. It's a difference between the Cartesian philosopher, who is certain of himself and never doubts, and the more kind of Hamlet-like figure who agonizes before making the decision, and has to go through what Derrida is going to call the ordeal of undecidability before making a decision. Okay. So we're going to look now at what Heidegger is saying that Dasein actually means. And so let's look carefully at Heidegger's own definition of Dasein, looking at his own language. Okay, so in the introduction to metaphysics, he's going to say the being of humanity is, in the strict sense of the word, being here, Dasein. So he coins a new term, being here. Is a Dasein. That's what Dasein means. And the being that is here, the being in the world, is not a Kantian rational subject. That's not what Heidegger's talking about. In fact, the concept of Dasein is articulated in direct, reaction against and opposition to the Kantian, Hegelian, Marxian idea of the entity that we are, being mere, rational subjects that are in the case of, for Heidegger anyway, in the case of, say, Hegel and Marx, that are oblivious to their metaphysical foundations. Now, this is not, Heidegger's going to say this is not, he doesn't agree with what Kant does with with metaphysics, with the foundation of the subject, the metaphysical grounds, but he does respect Kant for for being one of the first real modern philosopher to really seriously think about the question or problem of metaphysics. Okay, so the entity which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by this term Dasein. Okay, so note there. So we have this idea that a being is an entity. But it's an entity that questions. Okay, so this is linked to this idea that doing philosophy, for instance, philosophizing, is integral to the question of being. All right, and we're going to see for Heidegger, this is one of the things, for instance, that differentiates Dasein from animals. Is Dasein asks the question that is first in rank: why are there beings rather than nothing at all? And that's without asking that question, it's difficult to differentiate us from the animals. Now, in fundamental concepts of metaphysics, Heidegger has a lot more to say about the question of animals. And I can't address that here today, but when we read Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, he also has a really interesting take on Heidegger and his, and he in effect deconstructs Heidegger and his view on animals. We'll come back to it at that point. But I want to just note here that what he's calling philosophizing, or asking this question, why are there beings other than nothing, and all the questions is first in rank, is integral to the question of our Dasein, or what makes us what we are, the entity that we are. It's a central feature of his thinking. Okay. If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give a proper explication of an entity, Dasein, with regard to its being. Is there not, and he's going to observe here, is there not a manifest circularity in this undertaking? If we must first define an entity in its being, and if we want to formulate the question of being on this basis, what is this but going in a circle? So Heidegger is not saying that he gets out of this circularity. In fact, this question of the circle that goes round and round is very important to the question of Dasein. And of course, for every question implies a questioner. And this also is going to be linked to the idea of the what is at the center of the circle, which is, we're going to see in Heidegger, Derrida is going to call this center kind of a irreducible, intact kernel that is undeconstructible. But Derrida, this is one of the things that in his deconstructive approach is going to make him different from Heidegger, is that Derrida is going to deconstruct what is at the center of that, Heideggerian circle. So again, to think about what, and this is in Derrida's Structure, Sign, and the Free Plays in the Humanities, which was this shocking talk that he gave in the mid 60s, which some people say was the beginning of the post-structuralist era, insofar as it really launched a deadly blow against structuralism by taking on the idea of what is at the center of the circle. I don't know if you can even understand that essay unless you first encountered the thought of Heidegger. And there's no question that Derrida, Foucault, so many intellectuals of their generation are steeped in the thought of Heidegger. Derrida acknowledges the debt to Heidegger. He criticizes Foucault for his reticence on Heidegger and for not sufficiently acknowledging his own Heideggerian influence. And that there's some truth to that, because Foucault does say that it was reading, that when he first read Nietzsche left him kind of indifferent, but when he read Heidegger and then went back to Nietzsche, he totally changed his perception of Heidegger. So there's no doubt that Foucault too was profoundly influenced by Heidegger, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're Heideggerian, as we'll explore. Okay. All right. So we're talking about this question of the circle. This is, we're getting closer to this idea of the hermeneutic circle. Now, hermeneutic means is sort of the art of interpretation. It's the art of reading, even interpreting, and so it's a circle of interpretation is one way of thinking about this, and it's going to be a central concept in post-Heideggerian thought, particularly in Gadamer. Okay, so Heidegger says the indefinability of being does not eliminate the question of its meaning. It demands we look at the question in the face. We always conduct our activities in an understanding of being. We do not know what being means, but even if we ask what is being, we keep with an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what that is signifies. We do not even know the horizon in terms of which that meaning is to be grasped and fixed. But this vague average understanding of being is still a fact. Okay, now this is an early passage in Being and Time. It's a really important passage, and so I urge you to just pause and think about this for a minute. Let's read it again. It's going to say, we do not know what being means. But even if we ask what is being, we keep within an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what that is. Okay, so another way to say this is we don't know what the is, but we cannot help but presuppose the is. And this presupposition of the is linked also to the Gadamerean idea of prejudice, which he means in a non-stigmatized sense. In other words, we can't read any text at all, for instance, in the case of interpreting a particular text, unless we bring our prejudices to it. And so prejudice for Gadamer has to be looked at in this sort of Heideggerian sense. Is not, prejudice as hasty judgment is obviously not a good thing, but prejudice is something that we need our faculties of prejudging before we can even begin to make sense of a text at all. And so we a lot of times, again, we in almost in every case, when we seek to understand the world, we presuppose what he's calling here the is, or we presuppose being. But when we have to ask ourselves, well, what is being? We're thrown right back to the question again that's first in rank: why are there beings rather than nothing at all? We cannot not presuppose being. We cannot not presuppose the is, but we cannot say what the is. And this is a basic dilemma, the basic sort of metaphysical dilemma from which, for Heidegger, none of us can escape. We may want to not think about this fact, but this fact nonetheless remains a fact, that the presupposition of being, or the presupposition of the is. Okay, here's Gadamer. You can see he lived from 1900 to 2002. His two most important books are Truth and Method and the Relevance of the Beautiful. I really, I have a great respect for Gadamer, and I really urge you to read him. He is, after Heidegger, he's the most important figure in the German hermeneutic tradition in the 20th century anyway. And his work is really wonderful, and it has a lot to teach us. And so he does profound thinking on the hermeneutic circle, question of prejudice, pre-understanding, what the idea of the horizon, the interpretive horizon. Frederick Jameson is very influenced by Gadamer as well. Derrida had an interesting exchange with Gadamer. I think more than one interesting exchange, and I like and the way that he talks about what he calls the beautiful as being that which what he calls again the sensuously abundant object, is that which shows us that there's more to life than science can explain to us, is a really crucial concept. So he's worth a look. Okay, so what is a hermeneutic circle? All right, what is asked in the question that is first in rank rebounds upon the questioning itself, Heidegger says. This is an introduction to metaphysics. For the questioning challenges beings as a whole, but does not rest itself free from them. Why the why? What is the ground of this why question itself? A question that presumes to establish the ground of beings as a whole. Our question is the question of all true questions. Okay, so this is, again, the question of the question, the hermeneutic circle, this rebounding of questioning that the hermeneutic circle implies, in the circular structure, which is also a figure of the eternal, because the circle just goes round and round. It's not a linear way of thinking. It doesn't stop. It just keeps going. And there's if you stop and think about this for a moment, there's a certain truth to this, is that I could speak, for instance, as someone who has been working in the field of literature for a number of years. I've taught, there are texts that I love, and I constantly come back to them. This is one of the things that Derrida says, is that, the reading of Plato, for instance, lies in front of me. It's not something I did and I move on from. You always have to come back to it. And it's always interesting to me that no matter how many times I work with the particular text, my understanding of it becomes, is different each time I approach it, because of course you bring to it new prejudices, you bring to it new experiences, new understandings. And so books that I read when I was in my early 20s, when I read them today, they're not even the same books. And so there's a great deal of truth to this idea of the hermeneutic circle. So it's an important interpretive notion that I think you should attend to. Okay. Here you can see again, we've talked about what Nietzsche calls the tragic perception. We discussed this with relation to what Heidegger calls in the principle of reason, how his reading of Leibniz, how the reason, the principle of reason implies that for everything there is a reason, or there is nothing without reason. But Heidegger shows very clearly that reason is also a ground. And so another way to say this is that there's nothing without a ground, and except for nothingness, which has no ground. But everything that is does have a ground. Now, this is a metaphysical ground, but when we ask the question of why, if for everything there is a reason, we have to give a reason for that reason, the principle of reason doesn't give us a reason for reason. This is, again, what we talked about in relation to Nietzsche's tragic perception, is when the snake circles in upon itself, and it becomes again a kind of a circular questioning, but a questioning that does not end up in a particular thesis. Okay, let's go on to the next image. Okay, so all right. Here's Heidegger in Being and Time. He's going to say, in analyzing the structure of understanding in general, that what gets censored inappropriately as a circle belongs to the essence and to the distinctive character of understanding as such. We cannot ever avoid a circular proof in the existential analytic, because such an analytic does not do any proving at all by the rules of the logic of consistency. What common sense wishes to eliminate in avoiding the circle, on the supposition that it is measuring up to the loftiest rigor of scientific investigation, is nothing less than the basic structure of care. Because it is primordially constituted by care, any Dasein is already ahead of itself. Now, we're going to return to this question of care, because, as I said previously, care is was what Heidegger is going to call one of the fundamental modalities of being. And in Being and Time, this is where he discusses this modality, or this mood of care. And he's going to show that you can't really ever get out of care. The only people that get out of care are those who are dead. The only really truly careless people are in effect the dead, those who are totally beyond care. So as long as we're alive, we have to care. And so, science wants us to, give up this maddening circular questioning, which seems to be a kind of an irrational spinning of one's wheels. And yet there's no way really out of the circle. Here's Heidegger. We constantly find ourselves moving in a circle, and this is an indication that we are moving within the realm of philosophy. It's not even really a bad thing to be moving in a circle. Everywhere a kind of circling. This circling movement of philosophy, of course, is alien to ordinary understanding, which only ever wants to get the job in hand over and done with as quickly as possible. Have it done and be done with it. But going around in circles gets us nowhere. Above all, it makes us feel dizzy, as if we're going to fall into a vortex. And dizziness is something uncanny. We feel as though we are suspended in the nothing. Therefore, there must be no such circling and no such philosophy. This is, after all, the universal principle of logic. That is why all scientific philosophy prides itself on getting by without this circle. Yet anyone who has never been seized by dizziness in the presence of a philosophical question has never asked the question in a philosophical way, has never philosophized. That is, has never entered the circle in the first place. Thus, it misses the decisive issue here, which is an insight into the center of the circle as such. Again, remember we said every question implies a questioner, which implies a center to the circle. An insight made possible in such a circling movement, and in this alone. For the center of our Dasein only manifests itself as such as we circle around it. And this is why every attempt to argue away such circularity in philosophy only leads us away from philosophy itself. All right, interesting observation. This is from his Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, where he also addresses the question of the hermeneutic circle at some length. The center of the hermeneutic circle, that is the middle and ground, reveals itself as such only in and for the movement that circles it. The circular character of philosophical thought is directly bound up with its ambiguity, an ambiguity that is not to be eliminated or still less leveled off by means of the dialectic. And I clarify here the subject-object dialectic. All dialectic in philosophy, he asserts, is only the expression of an embarrassment. Well, that's a pretty interesting condemnation of dialectic. And again, it's linked to the idea that the rational subject is founded on a ground or the assertion of a thesis of the cogito, which implies a kind of a thetic metaphysical ground that is not properly examined, that is not sufficiently questioned its own metaphysical basis, hasn't thought through its own metaphysical grounds. Okay. Now let's note here, I want to clarify here. So one of the things that Heidegger is going to say when he talks about care being a fundamental modality of being is that care is that when we really care about something, you think of like Socrates who beholds the beloved, as we read about in Phaedrus. To care is to be to be held in a kind of a grip. All right, he's going to even say it's if you really care about something, it's almost like you're under attack. You care so much about being that you are held in the grip of being. And we're going to see that boredom, the other modality of being, is at the other extreme. Because boredom is when you don't care. I mean, there's nothing you care about, nothing, and so you're bored because you have nothing that you care about, as opposed to being held in the grip of being. And so the person who is bored because they don't care, because they have found nothing to care about. But to care about nothing is, again, to put us right back square to the problem of metaphysics, because nothingness is one of the basic concepts of metaphysics. And so to care is to care about being. To be bored is to have nothing that you care about. I mean, there's nothing in being that holds you in its grip. But the person who asks the question, who dares to ask the question that is first in rank, Heidegger is going to say, is someone who philosophizes, is someone who does care, who's held in the grip of being. If you're truly philosophizing, then you care, and you care in a very deep way. Okay, let's read him from what he says from Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. Man only finds himself affected at all if he is already capable of being affected in his Dasein, and can find himself gripped in this ability to be affected. Indeed, if this possibility of being gripped lies in his very essence. And okay, so the possibility of being gripped lying in one's essence is linked to what makes us Dasein in the first place, or what makes us human beings. The essential possibility of being gripped belongs to the essence of man, insofar as his Dasein, his being here always but not exclusively, implies being attuned. Where there is attunement, there is the possibility of a change of attunement, and thus also an awakening of attunement. Now, or also of awakening attunement, excuse me. So we got to think a little bit about this question of attunement as well. Now, you can think of attunement as kind of like when you tune a piano. To be in tune is if you've ever heard a piano that's out of tune, that's very different than a piano that is in tune. And so we can think of being in tune with being. So we're attending to being in a way that is very careful. You say Dasein is a being that is full of care because is attuned to being. Now, when we think of Socrates, who as I said previously, would be walking at the streets of Athens, and then would get stuck in some kind of philosophical conundrum and would wait for his demon to come to him. Well, the demon was he's waiting for an attunement. He's waiting for his mood to change, and so he can find his way out of his quagmire. And I note here too. Let me note in passing a kind of a funny theme that to think about for those of you who are coming to some of these philosophical questions for the first time. Rousseau, Kant, Heidegger, Nietzsche, all of these philosophers were very big walkers, and Kant liked to speak about what he called the ambulatory, and he was notorious for taking these, these walks. People like this, I used to say, would set their clocks by the regularity of his daily walk. But a walk for Kant was not just exercise. I mean, it was exercise, but it was also a way of discovering new thoughts. And so sometimes it's the taking of walks, the ambulatory, that when we find ourselves stuck in these philosophical conundrums that we can find a way past the feeling of being stuck. And the reason why we're stuck, again, is because we need a different sort of attunement. Like Socrates, who's waiting for his demon. We need to be jarred out of our comfortable chairs, take a walk, and let thoughts, come to us. Nietzsche liked to talk about the aphorism in that way, as it was something that would come to you. Now, if a thought comes to you, that's very different than a rational, let's say, a rational thesis that I assert, because like Mr. Descartes, I've sealed myself in a little sensory deprivation tank, and then I assert it, because I found it somewhere, inside of this thing that I'm calling the mind, So this is not a rational subject or Cartesian subject. A Dasein is someone who is attuned to being. Okay. Attunement, Heidegger says, is not some being that appears in the soul as an experience, again, like in the Cartesian sense, but the way of our being there with one another. Okay, so this is, again, worth pausing on. We've talked about justice in Heidegger as letting the other be in one's being, but Heidegger likes to also point out that being is always being with others, and this is where we get, questions of justice enter into this philosophy. There is because again, unlike Chomsky, he likes to talk about the Martian scientists looking at human beings as if they're fruit flies from some other planet in outer space. For Heidegger, being is being here on this planet, like, Kant with his existential idea of, the cosmopolitan right, 2 feet on the earth. But being here on this planet with 2 feet on the earth means also sitting across from or standing across from someone else who is a being. It was a being who is with us. So being is being with others as well. Okay. Attunement or mood is infectious. Another human being is with us. Someone who, through their manner of being, makes everything depressing and puts a damper on everything. Well, I'm giving this lecture in the context of the coronavirus. A lot of people are walking around pretty gloomy, right? So you can, you see people, if you've ever been around someone like them, someone who's depressed can very quickly, drag you down with them. All right. In the same way that someone that's got a more, say, ebullient outlook on life can lift you up. And so we're affected as beings who are with others. We're affected also by the moods of others, and this is a profound consideration, and it's something that we should not ignore it, because it does affect us in our very being as beings. He's going to say attunements are not side effects, but are something which in advance determines our being with one another. Attunements are the fundamental ways in which we find ourselves disposed in such and such a way. Okay, so there you can see a little tuning fork there. And you can kind of think of these attunements in relation to that tuning fork. On one side of that fork, we have boredom. On another side, we have care. Okay, so these are the two attunements of our Dasein. and the main modalities of being or our moods. Okay, so it's in being and time that Heidegger spends a lot of time addressing the modality of being of care. And so this is also where this idea comes from, that angst or anxiety is linked to existentialist thought. And if you're really, really anxious to the point like that you can't get out of bed in the morning, it's because you're overwhelmed with care. You care so much that you that you can't even, you feel paralyzed. And this is central, like for instance, Hamlet, who can't make up his mind, who can't decide, who spends the whole play waiting to make this decision that he finally does make. In this anxiety, one is held in being's grip, but care is fundamental to who we are as an attunement. We always care. There's no way to get out of care as long as we're here on this planet. Again, as I said previously, boredom means to care about nothing. It's to be concerned with non-being or chora, to have nothing that holds you in its grip. And so you feel time seems to slow down. We're going to see the German word for this term is linked more to boredom, is linked more to a long while, or it's the slowing down of time. And it's interesting, Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. It's a big book. It's a 400 or 500 page book. A lot of it's just a meditation on boredom. It's very strange reading experience to read for hundreds and hundreds of pages, asking, what is boredom? What does it mean to be bored? What is this metaphysical significance of boredom? It's a fascinating subject. I think about this little tuning fork as a way of kind of understanding these modalities of being. And again, I want to remind you here that philosophizing for Heidegger is a matter of care, to being held in the grip of being. That's very different from, let's say, the stale academic study of the history of philosophy, which one can memorize. Mr. Kant did this in such and such a year. Mr. Hume did this in such and such a year. That's not philosophizing. That's studying the history of philosophy. Okay, here's Heidegger on attunements and philosophy. We shall never have comprehended the basic concepts of metaphysics and their conceptual rigor unless we have first been gripped by whatever they are supposed to comprehend. The fundamental concern of philosophizing pertains to such being gripped, to awakening and planting it. All such being comes from and remains in an attunement. Philosophy in each case happens in a fundamental attunement. Conceptual philosophical comprehension is grounded in our being, it's held in the grip of being, and this is grounded in a fundamental attunement. Okay, so here's a nice little fable that he tells in Being and Time from the Greeks, that I guess this one's from the Romans, that tells us it gives us some insight into what care is. Okay, so here's the story. Once when Care was crossing a river, she saw some clay. She thoughtfully took up a piece and began to shape it. While she was meditating on what she had made, Jupiter came by. Remember, he's Zeus. Care asked him to give it spirit, and this he gladly granted. But when she wanted her name to be bestowed upon it, he forbade this and demanded that it be given his name instead. While Care and Jupiter were disputing, Earth arose and desired that her name be bestowed upon the creature, since she had furnished it with part of her body. They asked Saturn to be their arbitrator, and he made the following decision, which seemed a just one. Since you, Jupiter, have given its spirit, we're talking about Dasein, the human, since you, Jupiter, have given this creature its spirit, you shall receive that spirit at its death. And since you, Earth, have given its body, you shall receive its body. But since Care first shaped this creature, she shall possess it as long as it lives. And because there is now a dispute among you as to its name, let it be called Homo, for it is made out of humus, or earth. All right, so there you have it. That as long as you're alive, you're in the grip of Care, right? You can't escape Care. Everything that you do is filled with care. Every act that you perform is an act of care. There is no way to be completely carefree. To be careless, to be without care, is in the final instance to be dead. Okay. Here's Heidegger from Being and Time on Care. Man's perfectio, his transformation into that which he can be in being free for his innermost possibilities, projection, is accomplished by care. All right, we can only become better than we are through care. Care determines what is basically specific in this entity. Here's another description. Care is always concern and solicitude, even if only privately. He gives an example like avoidance. If you're avoiding somebody, or you walk across Red Square here in Bellingham, the center of our university, and somebody sees you coming, they go the other way because they don't want to see you. Well, if they're avoiding you, it's not because they don't care about you. It's precisely because they do care about you. They care very deeply. They care enough that they're wanting to move out of your way and have nothing to do with you. So there's no, even avoiding others is a form of care. Now, again, anxiety is an extreme form of care. Anxiousness as a state of mind is a way of being in the world. In anxiety, there lies the possibility of a disclosure which is quite distinctive, for anxiety individualizes. This individualization makes manifest to Dasein that authenticity and inauthenticity are possibilities of its being. Now, I like this because it points to something that is I think worth pausing on, and that is that a lot of us we live in a culture. I'm not criticizing people who take medication, because sometimes medication is very essential, very necessary. But sometimes, we live in a culture that over medicates, and we see this in our public schools, for instance. And so what Heidegger is saying here is that your anxiety, maybe it's something that is you should attend to. Maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe if you're anxious, you perhaps are awakening. There's something happening within you, and so rather than just sort of trying to drive your anxiety away, you can work with your anxiety. You can use it to your benefit, because it's part of what makes us authentic. And someone who has no anxiety at all, who is completely careless, well, that's I don't know. That would be kind of a monstrous figure. Okay, we must uphold and hold out in this terror. Now remember here. Just let me pause for just a second here. Remember when we talked about the three paths and the one path being the path that leads to non-being. As he said, you have to walk. You can't avoid the terror that you feel walking down that path, because the terror is finally about non existence. And that terror, again, as we said, is a productive terror. It's a useful terror. It's fundamental to philosophizing. For in it there becomes manifest something essential about all philosophical comprehensions, namely that in the philosophical concept, man, and indeed man as a whole, is in the grip of an attack. In philosophizing, the Dasein in man launches an attack upon man. This is a really interesting way of putting what it means to be, gripped, to literally be under attack. Thus, man, in the ground of his essence, is someone in the grip of an attack, attacked by the fact that he is what he is, and already caught up in an all-comprehending questioning. Again, because we said again already that being, if you are what you are, so we said like Popeye, that's a tautology. But it's here in the way that Heidegger articulates it. It's an unescapable tautology that throws us back into this vortex of this all-comprehending questioning. Yet being comprehensively included in this way is not some blissful awe. It's not like you're having some ecstatic, blissful experience, like a monk who's having a visitation of the divine, but the struggle against the insurmountable ambiguity in all questioning and being. All right, let's look for a minute now at the other extreme, boredom, which is the opposite of care, the other modality of being. Here's Heidegger's, as I said previously, Heidegger talks about boredom from the German as the long while. It's linked to this question of the slowing down of time. And the question of boredom, he's going to say, leads us to the problem of time. All right, here's an interesting passage from Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. Something boring, a thing, a book, a play, a ceremony, yet also a person, a group of people, even indeed an environment or a place. Such boring things are not boredom itself, or can even boredom be boring in the end? That's an interesting question. Boredom is outside, seated in what is boring, and creeps into us from the outside. You can feel the mood of boredom, sort of steeping upon you when you, which is something that immediately we want to sort of flee from, to find something to help us escape our boredom. Strange, ungraspable though this is at first, we must follow what everyday speaking, comportment, and judgment actually expresses, that things themselves, people themselves, event and places themselves are boring. How does boredom bore? How is such a thing possible? I emphasize time, and again, that we may not turn away from the fact that we find things themselves boring and say of them that they themselves are boring. Right? So the characteristic of boring belongs to the object, but at the same time, it is related to the subject. Why then do we transfer the characteristics of attunements onto things, since they are coming from us? Boredom is not a matter of simply spending time, but of killing time, of making it pass more quickly. I think it was Thoreau that said, you can't kill time without wounding eternity. This means that it is going slowly. Does being bored then mean grasping the fact that time is going slowly? Yet in boredom, we do not ascertain anything, nor do we grasp anything, nor do we make time the object of investigation. On the contrary, in boredom, we are bound precisely by nothing. This is non-being, kora, nothingness. All right, so this attunement, boredom, is important for Heidegger precisely because it links us to the question of nothingness or kora. Boredom means we're bound to this metaphysical, concept of the nothing, the nothingness, which is also, remember, the nothing is an abyss. Think for a moment about what happens, after you die. If you don't, for instance, believe in the Platonic idea that the soul is an oyster in an oyster shell, what one just is not, and is not for eternity. This is a disturbing kind of thought. Becoming bored and boredom in general are entirely rooted in the enigmatic essence of time. Okay, so this is also why they're important, why boredom is important, is because it's linked to the question of temporality or time. All right, let's now compare and contrast. We're going to start getting to a consideration of Heidegger's critique of the Kantian, Hegelian, Marxian subject-object dialectic. And we'll return a bit to this in the next lecture as well, when we talk about what truth is for Heidegger. I put that word truth in quotation marks. Okay, here's Heidegger on his critique of the subject-object dialectic. He's going to say the perceiving of what is known is not a process of returning with one's booty to the cabinet of consciousness after one has gone out and grasped it. Even in perceiving, retaining, and preserving, the Dasein which knows remains outside, and it does so as Dasein. The perceptive retention of an assertion about something is itself a way of being in the world. It is not to be interpreted as a procedure by which a subject provides itself with representations of something which remains stored up inside. Okay, so we might think here again, if we consider our lecture, our brief lecture on Kant, Hegel, Marx, and when we presented that diagram of the Hegelian transcendental ego. We have the ego, the id or the I, and the it, and then the whole transcendental ego is the whole or the total, what Hegel's going to call the totality of, the coming, overcoming of the two into a new, sublation of both into a new transcendental ego, not meant in a Platonic sense as in otherworldly, but an overcoming a whole. And so this idea that the subject then goes out and seizes the object and then brings it back into itself in this circular fashion, he's very much questioning and even arguably, deconstructing here. The basic trait of Dasein, which is human being, is determined by the understanding of being. Here, understanding of being never means that human as subjects possess a subjective representation of being, and that being is a mere representation. Understanding of being means that according to their essential nature, humans stand in the openness of the projection of being and suffer this understanding so understood. When understanding of beings is experienced and thought of in this way, the representation of humans as subjects is, to speak in line with Hegel, put aside. Being pro-offers itself to the thinking of Kant. And this, by the way, this is from the Principle of Reason. He's going to, where he has a meditation on Kant, and even on, he kind of speaks a little bit here about, let me say this quickly. The concept of reification, which is a basic concept in Marxian thought, particularly developed by Jurgen Lukács. Reification means thingification, effectively. Comes from the res, the making of something that is not a thing into a thing. And Heidegger never directly uses that concept, but there are places in his work where it's very clear that he's read Lukács and he's thinking about this problem of what Lukács is calling, reification. So we might kind of keep that in mind as we read this. So being proffers itself to the thinking of Kant as the objectness of the objects of experience. Okay, we could think of the reification of the objects of experience. Intrinsic to this objectness is the fact that a subjective cognition replies to it, a reply in which objectness first gains its full determination. For the Greek thinkers, beings were never objects, not in the way that Kant, Hegel, Marx thinks about them. They were never objects. Rather, they were that which continues on towards us from that which lies over against us. Okay, and so here's another quick point I'd like to observe is that that Derrida is going to say, for instance, that the concept of the subject is interdependent with the concept of perception. He's going to go on to say, I don't believe that there is any perception. And Heidegger is saying this a very similar thing here. Concept of the subject is interdependent with the concept of perception. He doesn't believe there's any perception. So for Heidegger, he doesn't speak of perception, the subjective perception of the object. He speaks of what he calls apprehension. And so apprehending being is not a matter of rational perception of being. So apprehension is not perception. I just want to underscore that point. Again, let me read this. For the Greek thinkers, beings were never objects, rather they were that which continues on towards us from that which lies over against us. Beings were more than our objects. Okay, now that's kind of, you can hear this makes one think of Lukács, who critiqued reification. And we'll come back to this when we look at Derrida's reading of Marx, Inspectors of Marx. In terms of the history of being, it is important to sharply distinguish between what comes to presence in what is over against us and what comes to presence in objectness. As the faculty of fundamental principles, reason generally is the faculty of representing something as something. This is in Kant. I place something as something in front of myself. This is, but for Heidegger, this Kantian placing of something in front of myself, the subject placing the object in front of himself, he's going to observe is the stricter formulation of the ego cogito of Descartes, of the I think, because again, the thinking thing is in fact a thing that thinks, but it's also a representation that he affirms. Reason is the I-ness of the I, the subjectivity of the subject. this unarticulated metaphysical ground. Beings are beings as objects for a consciousness. Since consciousness allows an object to stand on its own, it thus represents itself along with the object. It is self-consciousness. All right, now here's a similar kind of passage that also Derrida is going to cite in his "The Animal That Therefore Am." This is from the letter on humanism. Let me just briefly say a word about this letter on humanism. It's an interesting essay that this was written during the time that Heidegger was totally disgraced and was no longer able to teach at the universities in Germany because of his affiliation with the Nazis. And Jean-Paul Sartre became, interested in Heidegger. And you can really, if you think of Sartre's major work, Being and Nothingness. I mean, it's, being in time, being in nothingness. I mean, it's pretty derivative. And Derrida is very critical of Sartre. And Sartre is, sometimes his thinking is just a mess. I think he was on drugs a good part of his life, so Sartre's thinking is sometimes conceptually quite sloppy, but I think Derrida's right about that. However, Sartre did he was the one who one should be credited with sort of rehabilitating, if one was inclined to do so, with rehabilitating Heidegger, opening a dialogue with Heidegger. But Sartre, had entered into his Marxian phase. Remember, Sartre sort of started out as more of a pure, existentialist, and then he became, and this is oversimplification, but he moved in the direction of Marxism and became affiliated with Marxism, thought of himself as a Marxist. And so he wanted to appropriate the thought of Heidegger, but this is where we can think of Sartre as sort of the first, left Heideggerian. And then the letter on humanism, which Heidegger wrote in response to Sartre, was kind of, again, as I said earlier, was kind of a saying, thanks, but no thanks, Mr. Sartre. And it's where he's very categorical. Marxism is not what I'm doing. Marxism has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And part of the reason why is linked to this subject-object epistemology in Marx, which is oblivious to its metaphysical foundation. Now, that's going to be the Heidegger's view that the subject-object dialectic in Hegel and Marx both is conditioned by metaphysics. This is what he's going to want to insist. Okay, let's read what he says about humanism. The first humanism, Roman humanism, and every kind that has emerged from that time to the present has presupposed the most universal essence of the human being to be obvious. The human being is considered to be a rational animal. This definition is not simply the Latin translation of the Greek zoon, logon, eschon, but rather a metaphysical interpretation of it. This essential definition of the human being is not false, but it is conditioned by metaphysics. Okay, that's a really revealing observation. This definition of the human being is not false, because again, remember, he said previously that asking the question that is first in rank, philosophizing, is what makes us human, what differentiates us from the animals. So there is in Heidegger a difference between humans and animals, but it's for him more explicitly linked to philosophizing, or to asking this question that he calls first in rank. So he's saying, look, it's not a false definition of the human being, but it's conditioned by metaphysics, and it's this conditioning that let's say Kant, Hegel, Marx are for Heidegger oblivious to. All right, so as we come to the conclusion here are some questions for further consideration, reflection that we'll be pursuing in the next lectures, the next two lectures. What is truth for Heidegger? And I put truth in quotes there. We're going to explore some alternative conceptions of this rather difficult notion, what Heidegger has to say about it, and then we're going to have to explore what are the political implications of this way of thinking about philosophy. What does praxis look like for the left Heideggerian? How can one act in a political sense at all does this mean philosophy is totally useless? Now, and again, note praxis is a Marxian term of, applying your, this is why Marxism likes to think of itself as a theory rather than a philosophy. It's not seeking to meditate on the nature of the real, but to change the world, to act in such a way. Well, what, if one completely goes in this circle in Heidegger's thought, how finally does one act? And we'll look at where this took Heidegger, and he's a sort of what he called his bêtise, his stupidity, his self-acknowledged stupidity, and his affiliation with the Nazis during the period of the rise of the Third Reich, which was remains a blight upon his legacy. But we'll also come back to this question when we read Derrida's The Ear of the Other. And Derrida's going to have some interesting observations to make about, let's say, the difference between a left Heideggerianism, a right Heideggerianism, a left Nietzscheanism, a right Nietzscheanism. And so that will be something that we will most definitely return to. So that concludes this lecture. The next one, again, as I said, is on Heidegger and truth.